Today we are looking at the top 30 most popular comics of the 1990s based on their number of copies graded at the CGC, and we're going to look at the census, a special chart that I've compiled. We're going to find out a lot of fascinating things about what people collect, which books have hype, regardless of high print runs or small print runs. So let's dive in, and I'm going to point out a ton of interesting facts which you may or may not know. First of all, the comic book boom of 1990 to 93 had the highest print run of comics since the early 1960s and earlier. This was a lot of speculation, and this also happened in the sports card market at the very same time. And what's interesting, the comics that are the most important of the 90s primarily came out of this time period, as you will see on the chart. 1990 to 93 is what we have for 29 of the 30 comics on our list here today. Now, New Mutants 98 was not really a key book right when it came out. The print run was actually small on this one. 275,000 copies printed of the first appearance of Deadpool. This book would become legendary a decade later, as Deadpool had more and more series, and then of course the movies came along. So out of every comic published in the 90s, this one has had the most copies graded. There's almost 21,000 copies graded by CGC, and an incredible almost 4,000 copies graded 9.8, and almost 6,000 copies graded 9.6. And the average grade of every copy is 9.1. This is amazing. And of course, yes, there's a few 9.9 and even a 10 graded by CGC. So this is sort of the landmark book that everything is measured by at this point. We get into Amazing Spider-Man 361. This book, featuring the first full appearance of Carnage, has had a lot of hype in the last few years, but it's always been highly collected, as Amazing Spider-Man is possibly the most collected comic book ongoing series ever. Also, 20,000 copies graded with 5,000 9.8s. What's interesting is Spawn #1 comes in at third place. This is the highest ranking comic from Image Comics, and this is one of the most common books printed in the 90s. With a print run of 1.5 million copies, this book is a lot more cheap on the market, so you can afford this one a lot easier. But yet, it holds the record for the most 9.8 copies. You'll see there is almost 10,000 copies graded 9.8. And that book is way ahead of every other book on this list, including 6 10s, which is quite impressive. Now, the print runs of Marvel Comics from 1990 are a lot lower in general. So Uncanny X-Men 266, the first full appearance of Gambit, the print run is about 400,000 copies. Still high, but not where the numbers would get just a year or two later. New Mutants 87 also had a very small print run, approximately 175,000 copies of the first appearance of Cable. Now, this was a fairly big print run for a book in 1990, but of course would be considered a very small print run by 1993. Venom Lethal Protector #1 is a classic cover. I even bought multiple copies of this the day it came out. In 1993, there are 10,500 copies graded. You'll notice that this is one of 6 books on this list from the 90s that has more than 10,000 copies graded in all conditions. And again, this book had a print run of over 1 million copies and had a hefty cover price at the time. I believe of $3.99 when comics were mostly $1.50. Again, 6,000 9.8s. We're going to find that Spider-Man #1, which came out in 1990, is one of the first books that actually started this whole speculation trend. There was a bunch of variant covers, which hadn't really been done widely before by Marvel or DC at this point. So this was new territory, including bagged editions. So not only are we seeing the Silver Edition ranking #7, with almost 10,000 copies graded, but this is only one of the editions, and there's, I believe, 8 different ones, and they've all been highly graded. So technically, if you combine them all together, then Spider-Man #1 probably is the most highly graded comic book of all time. Infinity Gauntlet #1 is a surprising hit on here. Print run would have been, fairly high, but again, 1991, so not crazy numbers yet. But a lot of hype for this series in general. Spawned a whole series in the Marvel Universe. Number 9, X-Men number 1 from 1991. This was another big hyped up book which had a ton of variant covers. And so again, they branch out and there's different covers that people get graded. Number 10 on the list is maybe the most interesting one. Batman Adventures number 12 was based on the cartoon series. It features the first appearance of Harley Quinn ever in comics, but out of DC continuity. And what's interesting about this book, it's the only DC comic book to rank in the top 10 of most graded CGC books. And out of the top 10, it's by far the one with the smallest print run. The print run was 100,000 copies for this book. And also, this book was not a key issue at all for a number of years. Harley Quinn joined the DC continuity in about 1999, and then is when this book started becoming a key issue. On the census, you'll also see, I'm not sure if it's just because it's a DC book or because it was not considered a key for years, but there is less than 1,000 9.8s. That is much lower than every other book we've seen in the top 10. And moving down the list a little bit more, we get another Spider-Man number 1. We get Amazing Spider-Man 362, which is the second appearance of Carnage, also featuring Venom. So again, a lot of hype around this. In modern years, X-Men number 4 has become a major key with the first appearance of Omega Red. Again, the print run of this book was at least 1 million copies. And yet, here they are, high on the ranking. Number 14 is one of the most surprising on the list. It's the only book from Valiant Comics. And Rye number 0, first full appearance of Bloodshot, and the first appearance of the new Rye. Now, Valiant had a lot of hype, but very small print runs back at this time. And I believe the print run was 160,000. Again, that sounds big now, but back then this was considered a really hard to find book because that was so much smaller than the Marvel books at the same time that had print runs up to 1 million copies. In 15th place, we get yet another Carnage and Venom issue of Amazing Spider-Man. And again, print run of this was really high, at least 500,000. Uncanny X-Men 282 is an earlier issue featuring appearance of Bishop. 1991, again, not as much hype, but the print run would have been around 500,000 copies because X-Men was a massive selling title for Marvel at this time. And then we get Spider-Man number 1, the Gold Edition. So this one states as a second printing, and yet look at all the number of copies graded, including 21 of the 9.9s. Next on the list is only the second Image comic to make our list, and it features the first appearance of Medieval Spawn and Angela. And this one is over 4,000 copies graded. So that's 18 books with over 4,000 copies. So now that's really the big book. So now the numbers start to fall. We've got X-Force 2 and 11 coming up next, both featuring early appearances of Deadpool, which might be the main reason these books are getting graded. Again, a lot of copies overall in 9.8s. Then we've got Amazing Spider-Man 365. First appearance of Spider-Man 2099, but really just sort of in a pinup. But that had a massive print run. But again, everybody wants this copy. It's a key book. 22 is one of the most historic books on the list. Superman the Man of Steel 18. This was first full appearance of Doomsday, and this started the Death of Superman storyline. But when this book came out, the print run was only about 150,000 copies. It would have 5 printings in total and would lead up. Sales would increase week by week. And so, of course, this is the rarest issue of the entire Death of Superman storyline. And it's surprisingly got 5 9.9s graded. DC doesn't make the list much at all. There's only 5 DC books in the top 30. We get another X-Men number 1. This is the special collector's edition with a higher cover price and a double gatefold cover, and 3,500 copies graded. 1993 was a big year for DC. We get Batman Vengeance of Bane special. This is a one-shot, thicker issue, first appearance and origin of Bane, who would go on to break Batman's back. And guess what's next on our list? Batman 497, the issue where that actually happens. So both of these books generally equal 3,300 copies graded. In 26th place, we have Amazing Spider-Man 375. This is returns Venom. And the print run of this book was really high, and I remember buying multiple copies of this the day it came out. New Mutants 100 is the final issue of this series, and actually the one with the highest print run. It features the first appearance of X-Force and Shatterstar, and the print run of this book was 500,000 copies, which is much higher, in fact, double that of New Mutants 98. A lot of hype for this last issue. And of course, Deadpool would eventually get his first mini-series in 1993, and the print run of this book, I think, was close to 1 million copies. And it's now under 3,000 copies. So you can see we have 27 books graded that have over 3,000 copies graded. So Deadpool is just under that. Next, the most surprising book on the list is Preacher #1. This was a mature Vertigo Comics title published by DC, featuring the first appearance of the whole gang that would appear in the TV show about 2 decades later. This book is unique on this list because it's the only comic from the 90s published after 1993 to make the list. A lot of hype for this book, especially when the TV show was coming on. And also most interesting about this book, it has the smallest print run of any book on our list. The print run was only 90,000 copies of Preacher #1, and I remember having multiples of those as well. That was a hot book back then, still is today. And finally, in our top 30, Spider-Man 2099 #1. Not the first appearance, but it does feature the origin of Miguel O'Hara. And this one has just under 2,900 copies graded, 1,800 9.8s. So there's the top 30, kind of pointing out some details about each issue. But let's do some comparisons now. Let's look at what exactly do we get when we look at books that have been graded 10 out of 10. It's amazing any of them have that at all. But you'll see Spider-Man #1 Silver Edition has 30 copies graded 10. And Spider-Man #1 in 11th place has 13 copies graded at 10. And Venom Lethal Protector #1 has 10 copies. So it's not impossible to get a 10, but you'll see the majority of the books on the list, of course, don't have any. It's impressive that a lot have 9.9s. And again, in the lead for that, Spider-Man Silver Edition in 7th place on the overall list, but has 140 9.9s. And Spider-Man #1 in 11th place has 85 9.9s. Spawn #1 has 76 9.9s. Those are very impressive records. Looking at the 9.8s, Spawn #1 is way in the lead, as I mentioned earlier. But we also got Venom Lethal Protector has over 6,000, as does Spider-Man #1, the Silver Edition, over 6,000. So those are the books in the lead. The ones that are way lower on the list include Batman Adventures 12, under 1,000, and Preacher #1, under 1,000. So not every book on this list is just crowded with 9.8s. And finally, we'll look at the 9.6s quickly as well. What books far in the lead? It's Amazing Spider-Man 361. First Full Carnage has over 7,000 9.6s. After that, New Mutants 98 has almost 6,000 9.6s. If you look at the average grade on the far right column, you'll see if you took every copy graded, you get an average. So even though New Mutants 98 has 20,000 copies graded, if you average them all out, it's 9.1. That is an amazing high number, meaning that almost every copy graded is super high. And the book with the highest grade on the entire list is Spider-Man #1 Silver Edition. The average grade out of 10,000 copies is 9.67. That's incredibly high. And you might find it interesting to note what is the lowest on the list, and it is actually Batman Adventures #12. It is the only book in our top 30 where the average grade is under a 9, which means that half the copies graded, of course, are under a 9, and the other half are above. So hopefully you've learned some interesting things here. A couple other things I want to point out is that all of these books were published during the big speculation boom of the 90s, but all of these books came out many years before the CGC started grading books. So all these books had to be saved for many years before they were sent in to get graded. And many of these books are only getting sent in now, 30 years later. So that's an interesting thing about how many copies are out there. But if you look at it a different way, Spawn #1 has a print run of 1.5 million copies, yet there is only 18,000 copies graded in total. Does that mean we have over 1 million copies out there waiting to be graded? Or are we going to be surprised to find out that there are way less copies existing than we think? We know a lot of collectors hoarded them, bagged and boarded them, and saved them. But how many people actually read them, trashed them, have lost them over the years? It's been 30 years. Not all copies of books survive. There's no way to know how many copies are out there, but what if we even took the assumption that half of the copies printed are now gone? That still leaves us with a lot of copies, a lot of potential for more books getting graded in the future. Will this make the value drop as the market gets flooded? Or is demand growing on these books and people only grade books when they think there is potential for resale? So something else to consider is that the books that are highest on this list, in many cases, also will have the highest print runs because these are major key books that people bought in the first place 30 years ago. So that's interesting. And just to highlight again, remember we said there are 2 image books on the list, 1 from Valiant, 5 from DC, which means that 22 of the top 30 are from Marvel for this era. So definitely Marvel is in the winning category. Now, a lot of these books are not actually increasing in price much at all. So why are so many people getting them graded? Could it be that these are just considered the iconic books of the 90s and everybody just wants to own a copy graded regardless of whether they go up in price or not? So that's something to consider. Maybe you should be getting those raw copies graded just to have copies of the iconic books that people think of when they look back at the 1990s.